Okay, well, hello everyone. I guess we'll get started here. So, welcome to this Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice webinar today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Annette Morand, and I am the facilitator of the online Climate Change Adaptation Community of Practice, which is run by us here at OKR, which is the Ontario Centre for Climate Impacts and Adaptation Resources, located at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. So the way the webinar will run is as follows. So after this short introduction, we'll have the main presentation, which will go for about 40 to 45 minutes. And then at the tail end of the webinar, we'll have some time left over for any questions that you might have for the presenter. Therefore, if you have any questions during the webinar, we just ask that you please hold them until the end. So before we get going, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. So first, for those of you who dialed into the conference call line, your lines have been automatically muted, and the reason for this is just to avoid any audio distractions, feedback, etc. during the webinar. So if you'd like to ask a question during the discussion period at the end of the webinar, just dial *6 to unmute your line, but then please do keep your lines muted during the presentation. Also, you'll notice that there's a chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. You can use this chat box to field any questions that you might have for Jim during the question and answer period. As well, if you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can use this chat area to type your message, or you can click on my name and you can send me a private message, and then I can just try to help you as best as I can. I also want to mention that we are recording the webinar today, and I'll be sending out a copy of the recording to all those who have pre-registered with me, and we'll also be posting it to the community of practice. And finally, I know that we have some people on the line today who may not be familiar with what the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice, or the FACoP, is. So quickly before we start, I just wanted to mention that the FACoP is an interactive online community, and it's dedicated to those who are working in the forestry field or who are just interested in forestry and climate change adaptation in Canada. It provides a private space where members can share information and best practices on current activities in the area of climate change vulnerability and adaptation in Canada's forest sector. And it's free to join, so if there's anyone on the line who's interested in learning more about the FACoP, you can contact either Jason Edwards or myself, and our email addresses are in the chat box on the left there. So with that being said, I want to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Jim MacLellan, who has generously donated his time today to present this webinar for us on forests and climate, what next? So in this presentation, Jim will provide a broad overview of research trends in forestry associated with the field of climate change adaptation over the last 10 years using simple bibliometric techniques. And just so you know a little bit more about your presenter, Jim is a senior research associate at the Faculty of Forestry and Environmental Management at the University of New Brunswick. He's worked in various institutions, including the University of British Columbia, the University of Applied Sciences at Eberswalde, Germany, Environment Canada, the University of Toronto, as well as York University. Jim has a broad background in ecology, sociology, and economics, and experience with various analytical techniques, which he uses to support his research in environmental decision-making and climate change adaptation planning. Jim has taught, lectured, and guest lectured internationally and throughout Canada, focusing on the practical application of knowledge and techniques. His work experience has included both fighting forest fires as well as brokering securities in the Government of Canada bond market. So on behalf of everyone listening in, I'd like to extend a big thank you to you, Jim, for taking time out of your day to present this webinar for us. It's very much appreciated. So without further ado, I will now turn things over to you. Thank you.
Hello. Hi. First off, I'd like to thank Annette. Has been very good at sort of setting this thing up. I've never done a webinar before, so she's incredibly helpful. Also, because I tend to forget these things, I'd like to definitely thank Jason Edwards for sort of providing the context to be able to do this, and also my colleagues at the Government of New Brunswick for supporting this work. So basically, you know, my background is, I'm actually a professional forester. My background is forestry, but over the last, let's say, 7 years, I've actually been mostly focused on climate change adaptation. So I had an interesting opportunity to be able to sort of look at what's going on in forestry. I had an invitation out of the University of Maine, the Gulf of Maine Council, and they wanted me to give a broad overview of what's going on in forestry in Canada, which is kind of interesting. There's obviously better people who can do this, and I can think of any number of names. But on the other hand, it gave me an opportunity to sort of get back into this and try and use some of these methods to take a look at it. So this is sort of an outside perspective, and I think that's one of the things to keep in mind. It's like, if someone was looking at what's going on, if they use these techniques, this is what they would see. Not just that, part of it is also to get that broad perspective, but to also contextualize it within your particular circumstances. So we'll be doing that quite clearly. The idea is, how do we use these techniques for a province? Obviously, New Brunswick, that's where I am. But how you can possibly use these to augment what's going on. So there'll be a lot of discussion about that in terms of, things are going on internationally. How does that relate to what's going on at the local and the regional level? So to get started, I got to first off learn how to do this. The outline, that's typically done just for myself, but when I was getting ready for this presentation, I have an inbox where I'm supposed to file all these things, and I'm sure a lot of us have a lot of papers that we're supposed to be reading if we're from the research community or the in terms of practitioner. And this is a really interesting thing. How do you make sense of this sort of deluge of knowledge? And one of the things you might want to do, I know that everyone's sort of linked up to a computer right now, and I'm not trying to distract you in any way, but if you do a quick search, do a Google search just on climate change, you'll probably get some huge number that says, there's a huge amount of websites out there, over 900 million. And this is kind of what we're getting at. Like, how do you make sense of this? Now, Google will only give you, that first page, and these are the most popular and that sort of thing. And clearly that's quite useful given the fact that it's a very complex issue and there's a lot going on. So how do you then take that further? Well, another thing you might want to play with when given this presentation, so if I am boring, you can, play around with this, Google Trends. So, do a search on Google to find Google Trends, Google Trends, and look at climate change, and you'll find, I'm not going to tell you what, I have my own interpretation of some of that, but if you do climate change, you'll find all sorts of interesting things, and you can look at it regionally, and my students embed these Google Trends things in the wiki pages that we develop in one of our classes, and it really gives you an up-to-date, real-time sort of thing, and I think that's what we're sort of getting at, that these methods augment what's going on out there, and that's sort of the message that hopefully it will come through today. Oops, wait a second. Did I just... Hello?
Yeah, I don't know what you did, but it should be back now.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, it's just reopening up for me.
Okay.
Just be 1 second. Anyway, let's see. Okay, I have...
It seems that you have left the room, Jim.
Oh, I've left the room, so I will log on again. I apologize.
Sure. It's okay. And while you're waiting, I have it advanced to slide 4 if you want to wait for the program to start.
Okay, so thank you for that, and I will... Here we go.
1 sec. All right. Okay, should be good to go.
Okay, so here we go. Sorry about that. So in terms of the slide you see right now, this is something that I did for a colleague who was part of AR5. He was trying to get a sense of what's going on in the overall literature in terms of, so this, IPCC AR5 coming out this year. And the idea here is, and I think a lot of us know this, is that the literature is in fact increasing exponentially. And that's a really great thing. And not only that, but it's actually the diversity of literature. So this is first-time journal apparent through time. And all that means is that the journals, sort of those core journals that we have, well, they're actually the number of journals. And, by inference, the number of topics and people that are interested in climate change adaptation, that's also increasing quite dramatically. And this is a really great thing, obviously, because this is a very, very complex issue. But it's also a very challenging thing. And, our starting point is, because climate change will affect everything, is there something that we can do to actually give us a sense of what's going on? So how do we make sense of this vast array of fragmented information? How do we organize it, interpret, structure it? What's relevant? And I think that's the critical thing, because ultimately we're guided by these end goals that we want to, adapt to climate change in some proactive manner so that society will be better off or be prepared for climate change. So we use various tools, and this is sort of part of a larger agenda to actually use these tools that can allow you to see things in real time, augment, things like the IPCC, and just give you a better overview of what's going on. So in no way is this definitive. It really is sort of an iterative thing, and hopefully we'll see that throughout the presentation. So what do? You got all this information. How do you make sense of it? Well, you get a bunch of really smart people together, and they do assessment reports. Now, this is a great way of doing it, but I think we should remember that this is actually quite unique within history. That in terms of climate change, we've actually had these major assessment reports, and here are the 5 of them, and we've allowed, we've brought people together. It's a very complex thing. We brought them all together, and we've said, okay, assess what's going on in the literature, figure it out, and let us know, so that we can inform policy. Well, there are mandates there, and it's quite clear, but again, it's a similar sort of thing to what we're doing on the bibliometric side. How do you make sense of all this information? Clearly, this is by far a fantastic way of doing it, far more detailed. It gives meaning to everything that's going on, and this is a great way of actually, a great textbook for if you're teaching courses on climate change. But it's also a very labor-intensive project. It's a little bit, they have cutoff points for the literature that they're assessing and this sort of thing. Nevertheless, what does it say about forests? Well, again, here's these little things. And way back in 1990, if you look at the first sort of overview, and they're, if you kind of go over these things, they're not exactly lengthy. Basically the things they're pointing out have kind of been sort of the same throughout most of the assessment report. So at this global international scale, yes, we're worried about wildfire and pests. Yes, we're, of course, poleward shift. And, of course, this is being supported by the literature. So at that broad scale, it's really good to see that. But, in the next slide, you'll see that, in fact, and again, this is a very simple thing, word content analysis. So basically, I just took all the IPCC reports, worked through 2, and I was looking at forests, and in a relative sense. And it looks like our heyday was 1995, and we've been going down ever since. There's not even a chapter in AR5 in Working Group 2. Biodiversity has a similar sort of fate. So what does this mean? And I have a theory about that, and I'll try and remember that I had a theory about that. But the idea is that, these broad assessments are very useful, actually incredibly useful. But, one of the trends is that it's important to actually go from those broad scale trends down to things, sort of drill down to the local level. And I think this is one of the things that's been going on, certainly within Canada. So if we look at Canada, knowledge integration at the national level. Now, so what do? You get a bunch of really smart people together, or knowledgeable people, well, presumably both, knowledgeable and smart. You get all these people together and you say, hey, let's do an assessment. And thank goodness, because it's actually a really powerful document, the Lemons 2008 document. One of my students, Tina Nelson, was actually looking at what do practitioners go to. They typically go to the gray literature. And gray literature is actually, we have some techniques to sort of find out what's important in terms of gray literature, but it's kind of hard to track down gray literature. There's so much of it, it may be available, it might not be available, but critically, this report is probably cited in a lot by consultants, by just about everybody. And for me, sort of, again, I apologize for that. How do I go back? I tend to hit the space bar here. I'm explaining myself here. I tend to hit the space bar instead of the arrow key, and so I apologize for that.
No worries. No worries.
So let's see where we are here. So sort of ground zero. So remember, I'm talking to the Gulf of Maine Council, and I'm talking to Americans and trying to tell them what's really critically important. So for me, what's critically important document by Williamson & Son, basically a synthesis of what went into the 2008 document, but it gives you a very good overview of, extreme weather events, forest fires. It's at that national perspective, but it also regionalizes things. And so when I was talking to my counterpart from the USDA, I said, really, if you're going to try and figure out what's going on, I would definitely go to this doc, because it lays everything out in a very coherent way. And, in looking at the Atlantic region, and this is clearly what we're interested in, Maine and Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Brunswick, PEI, tree distributions, there's sort of these broad overviews. Insects are the primary concern. Drought is considered a minor force. Acadian forests are subject to damage, that sort of thing. So to get you in the door, this is great. But it also talks about, some of the things that you can do. So a very, very good overview. But not only that, there's other things that have been done. So this is part of a larger agenda, that part of CFS and Canadian Council of Forest Ministers. And they have sort of phase 1 and phase 2. And so in the first document, in the first document, we have vulnerability of different tree species to climate change. And in the second document, going back, this is part of this forest change program. And part of it is, and I'm sure Jason is probably wondering, I'm not really interpreting this well, but it's the third year of a 5-year program to develop a set of indicators, a toolkit, and an integration assessment, which was part of a larger agenda. But the other thing that they had done in that phase 1 is also this framework for forest management offset protocols. And again, don't want to get into this. Forestry tends to have spent a lot of time, if you look at the literature, on a lot of research in terms on the mitigation side. So forestry doesn't necessarily show up nearly part of the last decade, but a lot of great research was done, and obviously it's where it makes a lot of sense in terms of carbon and carbon flows and this sort of thing. So here's a bunch of literature from New Brunswick that was quite relevant to this. And it didn't stop there. They actually went further in phase 2. I think just everything is out now in phase 2, and what we'll try and do is provide you with links to some of these things. And in this we have, 4 documents: adapting sustainable forest management to climate change, preparing for the future, a systematic approach to exploring organizational readiness. So very comprehensive. Here's the vulnerability and mainstream adaptation and decision making, a very applied document. And again, we have this gray literature, which is incredibly important. So, the take-home message in Maine was, this is the first place you should look, because it is, in a sense, implicitly pulling all these pieces together. Vulnerability assessment tool, and this is what it looks like, different components, and it's actually, we've gone through the doc, it's actually quite well done. The problem is, you're looking at a place like New Brunswick, and it's not just about providing the literature, it's actually trying to get some things going, so action. And so what we found is it's not enough to actually have the documentation and the national assessment. There are different things going on at the regional and local level. So this is one of the ways we can sort of start pulling things in. So what motivated this? Well, one of my provincial counterparts came to me and said that, basically we had this document or this press release, balsam fir likely to disappear from New Brunswick. And if you follow this document back, it actually points to one of the reports, Vulnerability of Canada's Tree Species to Climate Change. And the idea was that if you actually look at the report, it's sort of a macro level analysis, and you're like, it clearly states that in the document that balsam fir will likely disappear. Well, CBC picked up on this as well, and the idea was that, wow, what does that mean? That we're going to lose balsam fir. And that was the sort of gist of things. And so my colleague came to me and he was sort of saying, can we get a statement about this? How do we respond to this? Well, if you think about it, that's exactly what these reports are meant to do, start these questions. And yet, how it applies to the local level is quite interesting. So there's a document, more detailed. So it's a simple question. The simple question is, will balsam fir disappear from New Brunswick forest? So again, we have this national level thing, and this is the implication. The implication is, this is what was picked on. This was the statement that was picked up on in the document. What do you do? Okay. Well, it's kind of a very laden question, because it presumes the ability to predict the future, and that raises questions about method, about who predicted it. It raises questions about scale. Like, what is the scale that we're going to lose balsam fir? Like, what does losing balsam fir actually mean? And these are really huge questions. And so, obviously, we're talking about things that happen over space and time. The standard sort of research, question that you would need to provide more detailed information. But there's also a presumption of preference. And I say that, I'm reading this, but the idea is that, is this a question or is this a problem? And I think it's a problem. It's like, okay, so clearly nobody wants balsam fir to disappear, from the Acadian forest. And wow, what are you people doing about that? And this is something that, it really is a question of how do you pull all these different elements together. So, I've used this with my students, and it seems to work out really well. So this is actually from actually kind of a seminal paper, I think in the 80s. And it sort of demonstrates the whole question of framing. The idea is we have a huge amount of information. What do we do with it? So in this case, this is a artificial intelligence question. And the question is, this robot enters a room to go for a power supply, goes into the room, power supply is attached to a wagon. Anyone who's watched their children play, these online video games or whatever, and then the bomb goes off and the robot is gone. And so, geez, I did it again. Okay. So I'll sort of brush over it because I lost the screen again. So clearly I'm going to have to learn how to use these things better. But anyway, in the next instance, the designers of the robot say, well, let's not use R1, let's use R1. It's a decision-making robot. So goes into the room, engages the deductive engine, sort of like, well, what's important? There's a floor under the wagon's under the roof. You're starting to get a sense of this. There's a lot of information out there that could be relevant, but is it relevant in the context of, and then boom. So you're starting to think about relevance. And then R2D1, relevancy detection robot decision maker, sits outside the room, focuses on what's important, and deduces what isn't relevant. And boom again. So it's sort of a bit of a paradox here. Like, what do you do? Well, basically what you need is R2D2. I think we all know who R2D2 is. It's, from Star Wars. But this is actually a paper by Dennett in 1987. So R2D2, the whole concept of this came from, Daniel Dennett. And the idea is quite relevant, and it's not really been solved. The idea is that, how do we frame this? Like, what is important? And given the vast amount of information, what do we do for this? Well, the literature is kind of interesting on this. So, problem framing. The initial representation of the problem may be the most critical single factor governing the likelihood of problem solution. Okay, and this is an old thing in management science, but it's relevant to start this at the very beginning of what you're doing. So what is relevant? Well, there's all sorts of things that we can do, but one of the most important things, given the vastness of the problem, climate change, is to actually get a bunch of people in a room. So get a bunch of knowledgeable people from around New Brunswick in this context, and have them start to sort of define what the problem is. Now, why is this important? Well, there's all sorts of good reasons why this is important. First off, amongst these is you're actually going to have expert opinion to be able to interpret some of the literature, and that's great. Part of it, though, is if you're actually going to solve some of these problems, you do need to engage locally. It doesn't do you any good that things are being done at the national level if you don't have the capacity at the regional or local level to be able to interpret what's going on. So how did we do this? Well, here's another sort of example of using bibliometrics. The first thing we did was do an expert mapping of the problem, and we tried to figure out who is here. And who are the people that have done research in climate change and climate change adaptation in particular? And so that was the first step. And, the whole thing about doing this analysis is to get those sort of aha moments. So the people in red are the people that we got from around the province. And the first one's Les Swinart. I didn't know Les was actually at UNB. And, he's a paleoclimatologist, paleoecologist, done some, him and his graduate students have done seminal work. One of the top researchers in the province. And, this is kind of really cool. We could actually go to Les and try to engage Les and try to say, we'd really like to know what's going on in ecology, the ecology of the province. What can we see? What's going on? Well, another person that showed up was Colin Larock. Now, Colin was interesting because what he does is dendrochronology. So the last 400 years. So Les is looking out over the last, let's say over the Holocene. Colin's looking out over the last 400 years. And again, we all know that, ecology of tree species is very long. Trees are very long-lived, and so it's good to get this longer time frame. Interestingly enough, it also gives us a very good idea of what's been going on in climate as well. So you have those fuzzy sets. We look at climate, we look at ecology, and they seem to be unrelated, but of course they're intimately related, and they both inform each other. Now, Colin was actually quite good because the gentleman to the right of Colin, the right of it is Philippe Gachon. Philippe had done some work with some colleagues out of the prairies, and they had used dendrochronology just to minimize some of the variability in some of these longer-term projections. And so, the idea is that we could actually have someone from Environment Canada who's actually an expert in regional climate modeling give us a sense of how we can get a better idea of what's going on in our region. After him is Charles Bork, who's a colleague of mine. I actually teach a course with him, but I was never really sure at least at this point, what sort of modeling he did. So I was introduced to Charles's work through the literature and through the analysis. Then we augmented Charles with Don Baisley and Mike Watton. Some of you might know Mike. He's more on the fire behavior side. And then we sort of rounded off with Dan Quering, who's an entomologist. And so it was a really interesting thing. We had this workshop last year, 2013. And we got some really interesting results. I don't really want to go over these in much great detail, but Les actually had some really interesting results to tell us that, in fact, we can see very dramatic changes in forests over very, very short periods of time, directly related to climate. Now, this is new research, and so the idea is about 4,500 years ago, hemlock very quickly dropped off the face of the map. And, will we see some of these things in the future? Very dramatic and provocative results. Colin was sort of, on the other hand, the last 400 years has been a great place to be a balsam fir, this sort of thing. Now, we can go through each of them. Philippe mostly focused on extreme weather events and sort of supporting a lot of things that we did. Charles, what motivated this whole question of will balsam fir disappear? Well, Charles does this macro scale modeling, a sort of a hybrid model, and so he was able to show us, very detailed maps. He's done analysis for Nova Scotia and PEI, and a lot of this we had government people there as well at the workshop, and a lot of this then research is brought to the table in the context of everything else that's going on. So to use Charles's research without actually having a larger perspective, we found to be limiting. So Don Baisley told us a lot about invasive species, and Mike told us that fire may not have been a big issue, but if you do get fire, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. That sort of thing. So these are some of the larger results. And one of the most, I'm glad Dan was last. Dan's recently retired, but he had one of these David Attenborough-esque kind of things, and showed us the complexity in terms of food webs. And this is balsam fir and spruce budworm and parasitoids. So these different levels on a food web of who affects who in terms of parasitoids and that sort of thing. And they sort of leads off his presentation with an even more complex thing. So the idea is that, do we know that pests are going to be worse? Well, it really depends on what's happening to the tree species, the original pests, but also the parasitoids and the hyperparasitoids. And so you get this sense of the incredible complexity. So what does R2D1 know now? Well, he knows that people generally agree that we can expect dramatic change. And that's not a lot. And then we also know there's been dramatic and very abrupt changes in the past. We're talking on a 7 to 10 year sort of scale. So hemlock just disappeared off the face of the map. But generally, it's been a really nice place for a tree, balsam fir. Fire is not expected to be important, but it is typically understood as a black swan event, meaning basically if it does happen, it will dramatically and almost instantaneously change the species composition of the province. Pests should definitely be taken seriously, but it's incredibly complex. Invasive species are very important, but there's little information. We should be worried about extreme weather events, so something that didn't come up before. So the question is then, how would R2D2 pull all this information together? Well, in the next slides, so you sort of end off with this. So it's this broad-scale scoping exercise. We have local people involved. We've got a debate sort of going on with people within the province. No, that's not important. That's important. And, we have some good sort of steam going into what? Going into the next stage. Well, the question then is what we're missing. So can we extend our analysis to give us a more general idea? So this is a very broad thing. Can we actually start nailing this down? More general idea of what's going on in forestry research with respect to climate change, and this is in the context of Canada. And then, of course, the answer is sort of self-serving, but the answer is yes. So we do have a classification scheme. This is not complete, but the idea is to start going through the literature, but not just forestry. It's forestry within the context of the broader issue of climate change adaptation. And that's critically important. These issues are very interdisciplinary. The idea that, forestry can sort of stay off on its own and do what it wants in terms of climate change is sort of irrelevant right now. It really is important to find out what's going on in all these different disciplines and look for trends where you can get support from. So we get some basic stats, and if we're looking at a broader data set of climate change adaptation literature, we find out that, what's climate change about adaptation? It's really about water and agriculture, and this is the Canadian set. And the forestry sector is sort of like, dealing with forests, sort of like third on the list in terms of the overall literature that's available out there being identified as climate change adaptation. But we also know, if we go to the forestry publications, that in fact it is growing quite a bit. It's been growing quite a bit. In this case it's 2004, but 2007 it's grown quite a bit more. We can find out information about what the top journals are. Forestry Chronicle, and this came out in the original sort of analysis years ago, but Forestry Chronicle has a pretty good impact factor, and it is really a good voice for people concerned with forestry issues. Mitigation adaptation strategies, the standard sort of forestry journals, but also climatic change and, adaptation strategies, those sort of things. Now, our original analysis, this was actually very, very important to people I was working with at Environment Canada, because they were able to redefine their entire field in terms of now this new analysis. No one knew, in fact, what journals they were actually were housing most of the literature, and they were able to say, no, these are our top journals. So these are all really interesting things and a lot of fun. But we can also identify articles by place. So this is for Canadian researchers at Canadian institutions, and we find that so Canada only says 9.4, but that's articles that are specifically trying to look right across Canada. A lot of researchers in Canada who obviously think globally, and Sweden and different parts of the world. But there's a heck of a lot of activity going on in Western Canada. So you're like, oh, so it's interesting to know that within the context of what's going on. Research subject, the exposure unit. And in this case, we do have some ecosystem distribution modeling, but it's mostly species-based, population-based, and it focuses on seeds, genes, species, that sort of thing. And there's a lot going on there. So almost 30% of the literature is really focusing on these projections. And you can see just a smattering of, some of this tree species. And again, there seems to be a Western bias, obviously lodgepole pine, not pine beetle. And of course, there's disturbance processes that are talked about. So this is entirely in a modeling context, kind of the sort of thing that's going on. If you're looking at methods, and methods are not always easy to pull out exactly, but almost 45-50% deal with models. Now you could say, well, obviously they do, but not necessarily. If you look at other fields, that is not necessarily the case. If you look at health, it's a different type of model that they use in healthcare. The diffusion models that they use, it's not really as big a literature base as they dealing with, institutional issues on healthcare, that sort of thing. So again, in the context of what's going on, these sort of things are important. Models are important, case studies are definitely important, but they don't seem to show up. And, but then again, what do you do with this? And so it's really nice to categorize, and that in itself is a really great thing. But part of it is I did this sort of analysis, sort of categorize things by sort of a systems orientation, strategic, tactical, operational. And the literature was almost all either strategic or tactical. And that kind of makes sense. There wasn't a lot in the operational stage, but it's, it's peer-reviewed literature, and it tends to have to say something in a broader scale. But another way we can look at things, and I did this with John Ennis back in 2003, was, and this sort of came out of the Forest Management Davis book, something to that effect, is if you look at things in another way, and there's lots of different ways you can look at it, but from this perspective, there's that very, inventory type data, which then is used to create predictive modeling. So is the paper really focused on empirical data collection, that sort of thing? Is it focused on predictive or model projection? Is this what the paper is really about? Or is it about making choices? And I call it possibility vetting, because there's a lot of choices created by the predictive or projection that are out there that we just kind of ignore. They're not even a ballpark. So we sort of implicitly get rid of them. So here's a different way of looking at the literature. And, I tell my students constantly, it's like play with the data. Try and figure out what's going on. So if we look at that, we can find that there's a lot going on in terms of prediction, especially, and then we know a lot of this coming out of the western part of the country. Data, obviously that's going on. This is kind of dead, kind of slow, but we can actually pull it apart a little bit more. So a particular paper may be classified as being focused on, let's say, prediction. but it will also maybe possibly talk about data a lot. So if you look at data, clearly it's focused on, creating models that can do projections, as well as the data collection itself. Nothing really about vetting or decision analysis or anything like that. In terms of modeling the projections and predictions, we see a similar sort of thing. It's way towards data and the process of creating these projections of species distribution. But there's often a little bit, and sometimes it's just in a discussion. Well, it can be used in this way or what have you. And it's a part of a broader scheme. So, again, a little bit going on there. If we start talking about vetting, though, so choices, decision making, we actually find that it's not been, if you go in the literature, it's not really been at the forefront. So if we look at the first workshop we did, we would say that what we were really doing was focusing on, what do we think is going to happen? What's happened in the past? And what are some of these broad-scale possibilities? Like, what should we even be thinking about? But there was really nothing about, then what do we do? Okay? So this is an example of, it's not a definitive study saying the literature is this. This actually helps us try to figure out what's going on. So filling in the gaps. How could we fill in the gaps? So hopefully this won't take as long. So we can do other analysis. One of the things we can do is sort of, if you actually go back to, if you go back to this, part of decision making is actually having responses and including them in the set of possibilities. So your adaptation options, what are the adaptation options? You can't even start to compare things unless you know what you can do. So that's one of the things that we did. We started, we're part of a couple of groups, and we said, can we just actually get a list of adaptation options? So this is where you drill down further in the literature. And Nicole Clank did this piece. And part of it was actually, she sort of categorized it based upon, resistance, response, resilience, and mitigation. And she did this great sort of overview. She, categorized it by strategy, and, so all the articles were categorized based upon these factors, and literally in a very detailed and sort of exhaustive way went through the literature and found out what are some of these options that are being proposed out there. And then you're able to categorize in a broader sense, start to make recommendations. This is part of some work we did for Acura that was looking at forest certification. So again, things related to disturbance. So again, this sort of gives us more about, we're getting closer now to, this whole question of what do we do with this information. We have more detailed information. We've gone from that broad view, we've augmented sort of these broader assessments. But then we now have a lot of information that tells what research, what they're doing, and what some of the adaptation responses might be. So then, how does R2D2 choose from among all these? Well, and this can get into some really interesting discussions about, slow thinking and fast thinking and comment and all this other kind of stuff. But it's a really valid question, which is why this R2D2 thing and this framing problem sort of stick around. We don't quite know how to use this. So, another sort of major document that came out not too long ago, something I was involved in, was the Climate Prosperity Program, National Roundtable, which doesn't exist anymore. But they did this document and they had these different sectors. And one of the things that sort of came out of it was in terms of forestry, and this is work that Van Lance was doing with his student Thomas, and they were looking at this means of integrating all the factors. So this is a very broad-scale exercise that uses climate scenarios, uses socioeconomic scenarios, looks at international markets, and then, but it also considers pests, fire growth, timber supply, species composition, and adaptation options. So here's an example of where you're literally sort of stepping beyond, how do you make sense of all this? At a very broad scale, done for a national scale, but also done at a regional scale. And then is that you and me? So, sort of also saying, well, we have this expertise in New Brunswick, how can we effectively utilize it? But it's something now going on to a very different level. So basically, we have a second workshop, and I'm not trying to promote it, but basically we have a second workshop that we're really trying to focus in on, this other side of the equation. So it's not just the basic projecting what might happen, but then what do we do with that information? And how do we go from that national scale, say a national scale assessment, which is going on right now with CFS, how do we then take it down to a regional scale? And what exactly does that mean? We saw in our first workshop that it's actually quite important. It is very important to take those macro scale modeling exercises and regionalize them. we find out that people aren't interested in fire, that people are very much interested in pests in New Brunswick and the Atlantic region, and those sorts of things. So that's what that second workshop is supposed to be all about. And this is part of a framework, proposed integrated assessment structure that we'll be looking at the workshop on. So we're looking at, again, we're moving towards an end user. It's purpose driven, but how do you then pull all these elements together? Well, if we go back to the very beginning of the presentation, yeah, we get a bunch of very knowledgeable people in a room and we ask their opinions, and that is absolutely critical. You'll never get away from that, and I think that will always be critical. But are there opportunities for actually scaling down to the regional scale? Clearly, we see this in climate modeling with RCMs and downscaling, but can we also do this in the context of economic modeling, in the context of what's critically important, let's say in terms of fire, let's say in terms of species composition, and then what are the policy implications? So clear, the workshop is more or less about that, trying to sort of take the first workshop, move on to the second thing, and look for the generic sort of protocols which we can do this. So anyway, thank you very much, and hopefully this has been sort of my overview of how you can use some of these techniques in different ways to sort of open up the question of, how do you make sense of all this given the large amount of literature that's out there? What's the context of this literature? How does it fit into an even broader framework? And then how can I use that locally? And I think that's, for me, the big message. It's not enough to just identify literature. It's very important to identify expertise. It's limited, but identify key expertise within your region that can then take that literature and make meaning out of it, help us understand what it is. But then there's still these gaps. Like, how do we then take all that and then move forward? And hopefully we'll be answering some of these questions. And hopefully my fumbling around with the web, the web pages here, it wasn't too disruptive, and I apologize for that. And thank you.
Great, thanks, Jim. Okay, so let's jump right into the question and answer period. Again, if you want to use the chat box to ask your question, feel free to just go ahead and do that, and I can just read it out loud for everyone. If you are in the conference call line with us and would like to ask a question over the phone, just hit *6 to unmute your line. So if there's anybody that would like to start us off, by all means, please go right ahead. If there's anybody on the conference call line? Nobody ever wants to be the first one. Okay, well, I have a question while we wait for people to think of some questions here. So, all provinces have finite resources to support climate change adaptation planning, and ideally, sharing resources across the country can make things far more efficient. So, are the institutional mechanisms currently in place? Are they sufficient for your needs? Jim, are you there?
Oh, there's a question to me. Okay. Well, I guess the message here is that there's a lot of different things going on across the provinces, and we do have that sort of hierarchy between the national scale and the provincial or regional scale. And we actually did another analysis, a webometric analysis, and we took a look at that question. So that was interesting, and the idea was that do the information offerings online, are they in any way structured? And you would imagine that they'd be structured in a certain way. And it would be kind of cool to do this after the fact, because we have the new NRCan platform that's dealing with forests. And this was before that happened. And it was not very structured. So the idea is that you have a web crawler that goes around, tries to find all the links between the different websites at in terms of provincial and national institutions. And there was not a lot of cross-linkage at all. But this was before, again, what's been happening recently. So it would be really nice to see if, in fact, we do share resources, at least virtually. But also, do we know what's going on? And clearly, I know that the federal government has a mandate to sort of keep on top of that, and I think they're doing a great job. And this is one of the messages we gave to our American counterparts, that in fact there are these regular assessments which have been just absolutely critical in pulling together literature and letting us know what's going. But again, you still have that local imperative to actually then take this information and use it in a meaningful way. So I guess my answer would be that things are definitely moving forward and evolving towards a more integrated sort of national, provincial scale. But that might not be the experience of other people.
Okay, great, thanks. We have Alain who has written a question here. I don't know if it's completely finish, but I'll read. In your basic stat slide, we see that water management papers are the more important in number. But is it among papers in Canada? Or
Yeah, that's a good question. So what we did was, and these things are sort of teasing things out. So I was very fortunate to be part of a group that was part of the reassessment of the 2007-2008 Lemon study. And, thank you to them. But the original study that I did, and so this is like, I think it was, pretty sure it was the first one that was done. And so this was more an internal thing and then, for Environment Canada. But we did the analysis, and so we looked at all the climate change adaptation literature in the world from a data set that we thought was representative of different fields. When I was asked to look at, what's going on in Canada, it became sort of a trick. Like, how do you actually pull that out? So what we did is, and again, these are very simple things. We went to the Shirka and NSERC websites and the health websites, and we identified all institutions that have been what's the word I'm looking for, but have been accredited by these different funding bodies. And we said, so these are Canadian institutions. We did an affiliation analysis, and we identified research. So the idea was that we could then go into the database, limited by this Canadian-oriented data set, very simple, and then try to figure out what's going on. Now, naturally, this does not represent everything that's going on in Canada, and I think that's critical. Gray literature, as we pointed out, is really not in that data set. It is entirely peer-reviewed. It's an extensive data set, but again, you're trying to get that broad brushstroke. So I think that's the sort of thing that you can do, and then try and find out what's going on, and we do get these broader trends. And the part of the reasoning of that is, we do scale down. We do drill down very much. We did a paper on invasive species, but also assisted migration. That was incredibly detailed, an incredibly detailed overview that also was augmented with some work on network analysis. But at this level, you want to maintain that ability to look at the domain or the literature within the context of the other literature. So, that's how we did it. So yes, in terms of Canada, water really is really important. And another question that could come out of that is, well, that's a very broad topic. And yes, it is. Water is another cross-cutting topic. So again, you have to drill down in terms of what exactly do you mean by water? And that's something we could talk about. One of the things that comes up very clearly here, though, is biodiversity. And that's another issue that's not, when it's talked about in terms of conservation, that literature is shown in a certain light. But in fact, there's a huge data set of literature that deals with climate change and individual species, which totally dominates, in a sense, implicitly in this field. But we sort of consider that as fundamental literature, and we don't tap into it. So hopefully that answered your question.
Perfect. Okay, thanks, Jim. We have some more questions in the chat box here. So Doug Beckett is asking, you note 37.7% of the publications came from or about Western Canada, and do you have any theories as to why this is the case? And then Bill also has a question there. Can the concentration of literature in Western Canada be due to NRCan specialists there?
Oh, I don't, I think there's some really, that's a really good question. And it could be focused. It could be all sorts of things. I don't really think it has a lot to, I can't say the relationship between at the national scale and the provincial scale. But for example, New Brunswick, we have, it's clear to me when I moved to New Brunswick, we have, 800,000 people in Brunswick. I did the expert mapping. We have a finite base of researchers within New Brunswick. So when you look at Eastern Canada, you look at Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, PEI, that sort of thing, you don't really, you can see that some provinces have a much greater resource base to draw from. I'm thinking of BC, but also thinking about Ontario and Quebec. So, that's one of those things, and it's one of those sort of ahas. You're like, oh, I thought I saw a lot of literature from BC, but there you go. There is a lot of literature from BC and Alberta. Why that is, that's the great thing about that sort of broad perspective. Like, I honestly don't know. And then I'll interpret that, and we'll get into it. We'll try and figure out, we could actually drill down even further, if that was a question. where are these publications coming from? And you can do this. You can identify that it's from this particular institution, and I'd love to follow up and look at that in that context. What's going on. But yeah, those are really great questions. Why is it particularly out there? And is it the way you frame the problem? So, good question. What's the other question? Sorry.
Oh, no, just the concentration. Can it be due to NRCan specialists being out there?
That's a really good. I'd have to. Yeah, and that's a great thing about this. I honestly, when I approach these things, I have no idea. There's a lot of aha moments. And it's like, oh, look at that. There's a lot going on out there, and I think that's a great thing. When we did I can give you the flip side of this. When we did so my big question though is what's going on with Quebec, and when we did the Webometric analysis, and there was a huge amount of activity related to climate change in Quebec, not just in Oranos, but also from from a research end, but also from the government of Quebec, dominated by far what's going on in terms of climate change. And I'd love to follow that one up. That one I think is a very interesting thing. So yes, there's a lot going on out west, but there's a lot going on in Quebec in a broader sense. So those are the sort of things you start to sort of pull apart, and part of it could be institutions. For example, Ontario, I don't think has a dedicated. Well, they do, obviously, out of Laurentian, but not dedicated to research. So it's sort of spread out among the research institutes. And tell me if I'm wrong. Hopefully, I'm not stepping over, the interpretation, over-interpreting. But whereas BC does have, PECs and Quebec has Oranos and that sort of. So, part of it is just that aggregation of expertise. Anyway.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Is there anybody on the conference call line that would like to ask a question? If so, just hit *6. And are there any last questions online as well before we wrap things up here? I don't see any more questions coming in. I'll give them a couple seconds here. Okay, well then I guess we'll wrap things up. So thanks everyone for joining us today for the FACoP webinar. We hope you enjoyed it. And obviously a big thank you goes out to you, Jim, for your time and effort and for a great presentation. So any last comments from you, Jim, before we sign off here?
Well, we will be sending around information about this second workshop, which I'm really excited about. And, hopefully I must admit, I missed my stride by not knowing the technology here, but we're actually quite excited about the second workshop. This whole notion of scaling down from that national level, but more in a formalized, structured sense. So not necessarily, yes, that the human element will always be the most important element in terms of interpretation, but is there ability to formalize some of these two relationships between the different forms of modeling? How informative is it to actually have, Van Lance will be there, so how informative is it to have a CGE modeling where you're integrating absolutely everything? And I've been read that literature, and it's actually quite interesting. So, these questions of integration, how do they inform us? And are there opportunities to actually include regionalized information? And I think that's critical because, you can only do, here I'm already talking too long, but here you can, national, international scale assessment, yes, it's useful. National scale assessment, absolutely useful. But at some point, you're going to have to get down to the regional and local level. And I think we're at that point now where we've been doing that. There's been funding from the federal government. So is there a way of formalizing some of these relationships? And I think that's what we'll have a lot of really interesting discussion at a 2-day workshop in Fredericton at the end of February. So I will hopefully through you, Annette, send out some information and Jason Edwards as well in that regard. And then I'd like to end off by again thanking Annette for putting this on and Jason as well, sir, for making the opportunity available to me. And thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining us. We just actually have one small question left on the chat. LA said, what's the meaning of vet expression in the slides?
The vet, V-E-T?
Yes.
Okay. Well, vetting is, and this sort of betrays my interest in artificial intelligence and that sort of thing. And the idea is that we actually create filters. There's some in psychology for this as well. We create filters to get rid of a lot lot of what's going on. So part of intelligence, they say, is what we ignore. And I think this is something, 10, 15 years ago was a big deal. That, it's not intelligence and, how we formulate answers. It's not just, how we actually target in on the answer or choose something. But it's also incredibly important that we ignore the vast amount of information. So in terms of our first workshop, there was an implicit ignoring of fire as a danger. And it's like, no, we don't. We have so much going on. We know we have a lot of experience with pests. This will be very important. But no one definitively decides we won't focus in on fire. It's something we sort of have to keep in the background, but that we should really be aware that it's there. So vetting means it's meant to take into, and I'm rambling again, but it's meant to take in the notion that there's a lot of literature, a lot of information, a lot of knowledge that we just implicitly ignore, but it is part of the decision space. It is part of the state space. So it's not choosing or decisions, it's actually vetting. So getting rid of information, and from that set, then making our choices. And this is sort of implicit in the whole scenarios framework, that we've identified 4 or 5 scenarios. And by doing that, we've vetted out a whole lot of possibilities. So we have to be, the idea is to capture that. We always have to be aware that, in fact, we're not actually choosing, we're also ignoring. Long-winded, I apologize.
No, it's great. It's a good explanation. So thank you. And then I guess we'll wrap things up here, everybody. So thanks for joining us, and have a great week.